Sweet. All right. So welcome to my introduction to AlpineJS. I am Raymond Camden. I am a developer evangelist for Adobe. I'm on our Acrobat services team, none of which I am talking about today. But if you ever have any need to do document management involving PDFs and Office documents, if you need a way to automate that via APIs, you should definitely reach out to me. I'd be happy to talk to you about it. You can also find me on my blog, raymondcamden.com. And I have joined the herd on Mastodon with that extremely long alias there to my account, which is at raymondcamden@raymondcamden.com. Very long, but hopefully pretty easy to remember. I'm not much on Twitter anymore, but you can find me there and my DMs are open. But the best way to reach me is either via my blog or via Mastodon. And definitely reach out if you have any questions about what I'm talking about today. I'm happy to give you a hand and try my best to answer your questions. So I want to start off. I think everyone here knows Luis. He was my introduction to Alpine, I think in March of last year. And I can remember attending a session, not knowing a thing about Alpine. And I think it was the only web session at that time. So he won by default and just being really surprised. And I like closed my laptop and started to pay full attention to his talk. So I really appreciate his introduction to Alpine and getting me to look at it more, and because I ended up falling in love with it. So at a high level, let's talk about Alpine. It is a simple JavaScript framework. And by simple, we mean like a total of 15 attribute, 6 properties, grand total of 2 methods, and a very small library size. And basically, it does a couple things. It will let you dynamically render stuff out in HTML, and it will do basic data and form field binding, and also give you an easy way to handle events. Now, it does do a bit more than that, but those 3 bullet points are pretty much all it really does. The website is AlpineJS.dev, and I will just click this just so you can see it. It's very nice and weight and powerful as hell. I do like their slogan of being jQuery for the modern web. Initially came out just a couple of years ago, currently on 3.10.5, and created by one person. I honestly have no idea how many other people contribute to the framework. I think I've contributed like a typo fix in the docs. That's about it. So, you know, I know Vue, when it began, was a very small team of just one person. Right now, Caleb Forzio, he is the creator, and based on my look at the release history and stuff like that, it's definitely still being actively maintained and worked on. It is Vue-like, and I put that in quotes, and I included a happy face and a red flag because I have a lot of experience with Vue 2. And so a lot of this just kind of clicked in terms of, oh yeah, that's just like Vue. The red flag is that, you know, sometimes there's things that are not the exact same. And my muscle memory for Vue definitely bleeds over into the Alpine side. So it's not a red flag as in a bad thing. Just going to keep in mind that if you are approaching this from having a lot of Vue experience, you may make the same mistakes I did as well. So it is really, really good for progressive enhancement and not necessarily for apps. And this is really where you got to take this with a grain of salt. And I get on my soapbox a bit. In general, I look at progressive enhancement as taking any basic HTML page and adding interactivity to it. So I may have a basic table, and I want to make it so that you can click and sort by column. And if you don't have JavaScript, you know, the table is still there, and that's okay. That to me is enhancing a simple web page. Something like Gmail is an application, and in theory, you could build something like Gmail with Alpine, but it really feels more suited to taking a page and making it more interactive. And something that I've been on a soapbox for probably 5+ years now is that I feel like all of the discussion around JavaScript is all app involved. So PWAs, routing, all these large scale things. And it's rare to see people talking about the smaller scale, but possibly more useful type things where I just need to make this page a little bit better with JavaScript. So the fact that Alpine is hitting that is a great thing to me. And certainly it is a gray area. I love this post by Dave Rupert yesterday, where, and I'll do the presentation sin reading from the slide, but it's not called an app unless it was made in the Appalachia region of the eastern US. Otherwise, it's just sparkling website. So again, just kind of keep that in mind where as I talk about the technology and you think, well, that may not scale to my 500 page application. Yeah, you're right. It's not really made for that. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. So let's start talking about how we actually use this particular framework. So step one, copy a script tag. In this case, I'm using the CDN. Obviously, you can download this to your local web server. There is no build process. So step one, you have Alpine on your page and you are done. The next part, and this will definitely be familiar if you are a Vue user, is to figure out your area of concern. And this is something that tripped me up when I was first learning Vue, coming from a jQuery type background. And that is, when you have jQuery installed, you can just do whatever the heck you want on a page. So you want to change some HTML, change a form field value, just willy-nilly, just add stuff all over the page as messy as you want. Both Vue and AlpineJS say, I want you to tell me where I'm working. So in this particular case, I am working in the right-hand column. This is the area I care about. This is where I'll be doing interactivity, not outside of that. So one of the first things you'll do when thinking about, I want to use Alpine to add something, I need to identify what that part of my page is. So I mentioned earlier the example of a table, and I want to add interactivity such that you can click a column to sort by that column. In that case, I'd be telling Alpine, say, hey, this table, this is the only area that you are working with. So an example of what that looks like in HTML is that you would have your header, your generic HTML, etc. You have a part of your page that you're going to mark. In this case, you can see it with the X data. And then after that, you'll have the rest of your page, including where I load Alpine. And really, the important part is that X dash data. And I'll be explaining what that means in a second. But in this particular example, Alpine is only going to work between that top div and that bottom div. All right, let's actually write some code. So X data, that's kind of like the core way of flagging that this is an Alpine progressive enhancement application. This is where you can define your variables for whatever you're doing. This is where you can add your event handler. So on form submit or on table header click. This is also where you could say, hey, Alpine, when you start up, I want you to do some stuff, do an AJAX call to load some data. And I may just have some ad hoc miscellaneous type methods that I need for what I'm building. And to be clear, you can build an entire application within that particular attribute. As a simple example of what that looks like, in my HTML, I have my X data, and the value of that is a JavaScript object. I have two keys, name and age. I don't have any logic here yet, but I have defined two static variables right within my HTML. And by the way, if that's like making you cringe a little bit, don't worry. I'm going to make you feel better in a bit. This is where I was both excited and cringing when I was seeing Luis present on it. So how do we actually render data? We have two attributes, an xtext and an xhtml. And as you could probably guess, one of those is for representing pure simple values, while the other is appropriate for content that may have HTML markup. how that looks in HTML. I take a span, I add the xText attribute, I point it to a variable, and I do the same thing for age as well. Now, I could do that within a div, within a p tag, basically anywhere that makes sense. This is one difference from Vue.js where I don't just have like brackets in the middle of my HTML. I actually have a DOM item that is being bound to that variable. So it's a bit more typing, but I'm okay with that. And how this looks actually running, I have a little code pin here. You can see my HTML, you can see my data. As I change it and say I'm Raymundo, it's going to automatically update. Now, in this case, CodePen actually reloaded this div. But if I had some process that was modifying the data, it would automatically update the render the second that it changes. And if we could test HTML, just so you can see it not working. Hello. Oh. And thank you, CodePen, for adding that. I think I know how to format my code. Thank you very much. So again, xtext is not going to do HTML. I can fix that by just saying x HTML, and it should work perfectly. All right. And by the way, we're a very small group, so y'all can definitely interrupt me. I can't see any hands or anything like that, so just speak over me.
We'll make sure we announce anything that comes up.
Absolutely. Thank you. Let's talk about conditionals. Again, very much like Vue, we have a directive that will hide and unhide things in the DOM, as well as a directive that will actually physically, well, electronically, I guess, add and remove stuff from the DOM. And the peculiarities of when you would use those really depends on what you're doing. But again, this matches pretty much exactly the way Vue.js does it as well. One big difference is that if you use xif, you have to use it on a template tag, and you have to have a root element, so like a p tag or a div, or something inside that div that wraps the content that you're showing. So here's an example of it in play. Again, I just have two variables defined on top. You can see my name, and I'm using xshow on a div tag to say if my name is equal Raymond, then hi Ray. And for xif, again, it has to be on a template, and it has to have a root element. In this case, I have the p tag, and my logic there is age greater than 40. And we'll run this, and just to make sure things work, we'll say I'm Raymundo again, and that hi Ray should go away. And I'm going to magically get 4 years old. To be honest, that's my maturity level, so that works out just fine. But you can see that went away. And if I were to right click and go into the DOM, this p tag in the text is definitely gone, whereas this div is there but is hidden. Basic attribute binding via x-bind. And you could say x-bind the attribute that I want to bind and point to a particular value. And like Vue, because this is used so often, we have a shorthand where just colon something equals some value. So as a real example of that, 1 second. I have a very simple Alpine application of one variable, cat image, and I bound that to the image tag such that the source value matches the value of that variable. And this is going to work as you expect. And because this is bound, if that data changes in any way, then the value would change as well. And I'm just doing image source here. Obviously, any attribute can be bound like that. For basic looping, we have an x-4. You can also get access to the loop index if you want it. And like xif, you have to have a template tag as the root for that particular value. Now yes, I thought I was going to add something to that, but I'm not. Like Vue, again, if you plan on doing a lot of reordering, and that kind of goes back to the table example I mentioned, for better performance, you can give your loop a key value to use, and that will help. And this is not required per se, but it will help in performance. So an example of what that looks like in code, I have a cat's value that's an array of simple values. I'm using x4 and saying cat in cats, and basically saying loop over every cat's element and create a variable cat that points to that particular string. Again, I'm putting that in a template tag, and I have a root element of p. So if I was doing a bulleted list, for example, I would have an li and a closing li there with my ul and closing ul outside of that. And I may show an example of that in a second. If I want my index, I just ask for it, and you can see I've done it there. So cat, comma, idx and cats, and it is zero based because of course it's JavaScript. And you see an example here. This first one just looping over, second one actually using the index. And I mentioned the unordered list example, so let's quickly do that. I love being able just to write in CodePen and colon saw like that, and we should get bullets. But again, template tag is where the x4 is. I'm not doing it on the li itself. One more example, looping over a more complex object. In this case, I have an array of objects. I went ahead and added the key value pointing to a primary key in my data. And outside of that, inside my loop, I can now do things a bit more dynamic, object notation, I should say. So I have cat.image and cat.name, and you can see that right there, like so. So form binding, this will use x-model, works on all form fields, and I have an asterisk here because if you're like me, you'll do the same thing I did when I was learning Vue.js and run into the issue where a input type equals file can't be an x model because you can't have JavaScript write values to a file field because that'd be a security risk. But outside of that, it works as expected. So you can bound to a drop-down, text area, text box, radio checkbox, etc. It also supports modifiers to help clue in Alpine into what type of value that you're working with, whether it be a number or a string, etc. As an example of what that looks like, I have an Alpine application of one variable, name. And I'm both outputting it and putting it into a form field and using X model to say, hey, bind this form field to my data. So in this example, I have a name, I have an isCool, and I have an age. And just to kind of show you, by the way, a couple of things here. So I have a span that's only going to show when isCool equals true. And it adds, and you are cool. You can also do basic, logic. It's a JavaScript expression here for xtext. So you can see right there, next year I will be 50. And if I modify my name, Raymond, you see it updates immediately. So you get that one-to-one binding. Same for isCool. If I set that to no. Oh, and by the way, this little weird drop down over here, that's a CodePen embed issue. It's not Alpine at all. You can see that it went away though when I said I wasn't cool, but I'm definitely cool. And I have my age bound to age. And what happens when I add to it, let's say I am 490, it actually adds a 1 to the end because it treated it as a string. Luckily, the fix for that is incredibly complex. You add that modifier right there to set age to a number. So now if I do 490, I get 491. And again, I'm primarily just showing text fields. It definitely works with other ones. In fact, if I change isCool to false, we'll see that drop down change automatically. But again, I could use radio buttons, I could use checkboxes, etc.
So for the binding, is it can you only bind to the AlpineJS variables, or can you bind to like vanilla JS or like vanilla JavaScript, or even just other attributes in the HTML?
So the short answer is yes, you can only bind to your data. You could definitely do something a bit more complex, like, all right, so can you give me like a practical example of what you mean by that?
So let's say I'm pulling in some data via an Ajax call or something like that, and then that is a JavaScript variable. Can I bind to like those results or that type of stuff?
Absolutely. And I have an example of that coming up.
Cool. And then as far as like the HTML attributes, so let's say in a form, let's say it could be, I'm drawing a blank right now, what an item could be, like a color picker or something like that. That's not necessarily bound to a variable, but like has an attribute itself.
So you have the binding, the colon attribute equals value. Like you have that. X model is going to be specifically for values and form fields. So remember, like I had the image source, right, tied to a data variable.
Yeah. So
yeah, I'm definitely showing an example where the data comes later via Ajax. That's coming up pretty soon.
okay, thanks.
So for getters, this is a way of making a function act as a value. In Vue.js, this would be, I'm actually drawing a blank, not the virtual properties, but they had a way in Vue of saying, hey, this particular function I'm using in my DOM is actually not a value, but a function. So Alpine has the same thing. It recognizes automatically when that value changes. So if I'm using something that's bound to two variables, it will recognize when any of them changes and will rerun itself. You do not have to use the get modifier, but I like having it there because it flags it as a getter. An example of what this looks like. I have two pieces of data. I have first name and last name, and I want to create essentially a virtual property called full name. You see I'm using it on line 9, and it looks just like any other regular Alpine variable, but in this case, it's actually calling a getter, a function that's doing custom logic. And Alpine is going to parse this code. It's going to recognize, hey, I need to rerun whenever any of these two variables change, and it will automatically update the value of full name. So as this working, Raymond the 9th, Camden the 10, and again, full name is in here working. And if I wanted to add, and this obviously is just for me, Mr. Plus, it would just end up being part of the getter. And again, if I change that value, the getter updates automatically. And again, I can take off this access modifier, but personally, I like seeing that there because I know what's happening. And I really should have a semicolon at the end. I am pro semicolon. So events, you have an X dash on attribute. An example of this would be on the button, X on click, do something. Again, like Vue.js, because this is used so often, there is a shorthand with the @ symbol. So @click equals do something. And like with X model, there's modifiers that impact how the event is run, doing the handy things like automatically preventing default. Perhaps you want to listen for a keyboard event, but you only care about, let's say, the F1 key or something like that. Alpine makes that pretty easy to use. And like the X model change I did, it's just a dot value after that. In this case, I'm saying click, but also prevent the default submit action and then run some func. Here's an example of this running. You see in Xdata, I have a variable and I have logic defined in there. And again, if you were cringing, I promise, keep waiting. I'm going to fix this up all better for you. But I use the variable in my input field with X model, and then my button is there specifically to say, click this, run that logic, and it's going to access the local scope by doing this dot, and then run some logic on it. So if we run this, my name is Ray, uppercase Raymond, and I see that typo there that I will fix later. I definitely won't forget. but right now I'll do that. So I've mentioned a couple times about how, I think so far this is cool, but I know when I was sitting there watching Luis present on this, I was very, very happy, but right away I was thinking there's got to be a way to not have an X data thing where I have logic and data all within my HTML. Like I don't want like 30 lines of a div tag that's all within one quote and having to escape out quotes, for example. I do not want to worry about that. So good news, you can absolutely move that JavaScript to be in JavaScript instead of embedded in a div tag. So the way that you do that in your code, you're going to listen for an Alpine init event. This is basically Alpine itself being loaded. And then you're going to define via alpine.data your application. And you'll do your variables and your getters, event handlers, random methods, etc. This is an example of how it looks. This is the same code that I had before, except that now all the logic that where I define my name value, I have my handler for the button. That's all been moved out to where it should be in the lovely JavaScript. And you can see right here on line 1, again, that basically is Alpine is loaded. And then line 2 is I'm basically defining what my app, and I'll go back to the HTML here. Y'all tell me if I go too slow. This X data equals my app. My name here is going to map that name. So I have the exact same logic just to confirm it works. Exact same logic, except now my HTML looks a lot more like it did in Vue.js, where I just have some extra sugar in my HTML and all the logic is gone. So Ray explained x-cloak. You see I've added it to the attribute here and in the CSS, it's hiding. This, again, like Vue.js, this handles hiding anything in the DOM that's Alpine related until Alpine is loaded. So I would not, for example, see any spans of X-texts and stuff like that until the application is actually properly loaded. Any questions on that? Sounds like no, so I'm going to move on. Alpine has a system of handling a life cycle of doing things at certain times. It has a concept of initialization, and this is for your application. This is different than Alpine itself being ready. It has the ability to watch particular variables and events. So, for example, it can watch for a variable to change, and when something changes, do whatever logic makes sense. It also has an X effect, which is almost like a reverse of that, where you define a function that uses your variables, in this case, some data. And when some data changes, it reruns that particular function, in this case, DOM something, which is definitely not a typo for do something. Alpine init, again, and that is the life cycle of the library itself being loaded. And Alpine initialized is the application completely done loading. So as an example of how this looks, specifically the init function, what I've done here is told Alpine, when you initialize, I want you to hit a remote API. And so, Nick, you were asking about making data bound to an AJAX call. This is one way of doing it. In this particular example, it's bound to the application loading. If I was doing like an AJAX-based search or something, I could also have just a basic method that's run on a button click that calls a server, gets the data, and assigns a variable. Do note that I have defined cats. I've set it as empty. When my thing is starting up, I do that remote call, I get my result, and then I assign the value to that result. So as a real-world example of this, I found a API that returns events for the current day. In this case, I have events, I have births, and I have deaths. And you can see I'm using X4 for all three of those and a unordered list, and basically going over events, births, and deaths. And you can see all kind of fun stuff happen. And of course, we all know about the traffic accident between an oil tanker truck and what's that make a little bit happier? A lot of bad things happen in history. How about a birth? Luis of Nassau. I have no idea who that is. Hopefully a good person, but they were born on this day. So the logic behind all this is just using that lifecycle event, in this case, just the init one, where I call that particular API, I get my data, and then just write stuff out. And by the way, I should definitely have some error handling there. In any of my examples where you don't see error handling, Alpine absolutely doesn't stop you from doing that. When I present and I blog, I try to make things as simple as possible. But in production, you would definitely want to check that fetch call to make sure that it actually worked correctly. Another fun part of Alpine, fun because it has a great name, magics. These are essentially special variables that you have access to. You can get access to the current DOM element. You can get references to other things in your DOM, and I will show an example of refs coming up. If you want to, that should be dispatch, not dispath. I have a lot of typos this time, I apologize. If you want to dispatch an event, they created a nice shorthand for that. Next tick is essentially a way to handle doing something after data has updated. This is pretty much taken right from Vue.js, so you may recognize it from there. You have, if you need it, a pointer to the top level DOM element that the Alpine application is bound to. You also have access to the top level data if you want to kind of look at all of your data at once. And you also have a magic way of generating a unique ID. And I'll show an example of that and refs. So to start off with ID, this is handy in cases where you are dynamically, creating HTML. In this case, I'm creating multiple paragraph tags, and I need to ensure each of them have a unique ID. The way that works is I call $ID, I give kind of a prefix, and then it will automatically make each of these unique. And if we look at the DOM here, and it's way over here, but you could see it gave it an ID of catlist-2. First one's 1, second one is 3. So again, if that's something that you need, you have a magic variable built in. The other kind of cool one is refs. I mentioned before that, why aren't you loading? You worked earlier. Let's edit you on CodePen. Well, that's interesting. Y'all are still there, right? Hello?
Yep, we're here.
Oh, okay.
Yep, we're here.
Yeah, I thought maybe my connection died. You were working today. I tried you and no errors. I don't know. I don't want to know what's new. Thank you for trying to help. Oh, my server died with 500? There's no way that Alpine's not loading. Let's see real quick. We've been doing Alpine all day. Oh my goodness. Well, it took, I'm happy it didn't do this earlier. I may just be explaining to you what the code is doing then. So remember earlier when I said you could download the Alpine library and run it locally? This is a great example of why you would do that. So I'll just explain the code that you would be seeing. So I mentioned earlier where you have Xdash model and it works everywhere, except it doesn't really give you access to write back to a file. One of the things, or file field, I should say. So one of the ways you get around that is by using refs. In this case, I have my input type equals file. I specified xref equals my file, like, hey, I want a reference to this later called my file. And then in my JavaScript, I use it where right there. I read from it the particular file children. So if this were working, you would see a file field. I'd click it, I'd pick an image, and then I would get a render below right there. And you can see I'm doing an image source there. And let's see if by any wild chance they corrected themselves. That really, really sucks. I am almost done with my presentation, but that sucks. Yes, it happens. So it just so happens I am at the end. I would definitely recommend downloading Alpine. But again, the main site is AlpineJS.dev. They do have a Discord. I'm not on it because I'm just not a fan of Discord. I feel like there's way too many chat things out there. I have 500 Slacks. It's just crazy. They are on Twitter. I don't believe they're on Mastodon yet. This link goes to all of my CodePen collections, which will all be broken right now, but hopefully fixed real soon. There we go. Okay, let me quickly show this now that it's running. Yay. Get rid of the console. And I will just pick a picture. And surprise, surprise, I have a lot of cat pictures. I chose cat icon like so. And again, so just an example of the refs magic variable. And then I have my own post on Alpine, basically kind of me learning and playing with it. So if you just kind of want to kind of go through, and I have a couple examples here that you may find interesting, like using Google Maps with it, using Cloudinary, etc. I also have a good Alpine.js template for Glitch. That's a pretty cool service I've been using recently. A few things that I did not cover. They do have transition, much like Vue.js. I'm not necessarily a big fan of transitions because I feel like they get annoying. One of the things that I suggest to people, like, hey, you know, if the client comes in and say, you know what, I want the user to click, and then I want the data to fade in. One of the things I suggest is that you add that, and then you run that 100 times. And if you're not pulling your hair out by, you know, run number 50 or so, then yeah, keep it in. But if you find yourself cursing, waiting for that to finish, yank that crap out. Alpine does have good support for it. There's also a basic plugin architecture, and you can extend it. All this is covered in the docs, and I am open to any questions. Remember, I can't see all faces, so please tell me if you have any.
Okay, Ray, I wonder if there are any examples of add, editing, or deleting records, which is something every project has to do.
Yeah. So that on the front end is going to be basic DOM manipulation, right? So if I'm building a basic CRUD where the initial view is to get a list of records, and then you can click to edit, and then maybe beneath that, there's a button to add a new record. All of that's been covered by what I showed. The back end for that would be completely up to you. So Cold Fusion, Node.js, Java, whatever on the back end. But Alpine would essentially be taking what you have in those form fields, like when you click to make a new record, it'd be taking that and just sending it to your server to actually preserve it. You can do CRUD completely on the client side using something like IndexedDB, for example. And that would not be Ajax based. That would just be persisting a local client storage.
Okay. Anybody else have any questions?
I guess I'm still trying to wrap my head around like the only variables that you can actually interact with in the JavaScript world are ones that you define in the AlpineJS. That kind of like for the binding and all that type of stuff doesn't seem to be really any way to do that. Because I'm thinking like, okay, I'm getting data from other places and I have to then redefine those and copy those in and things like that, right?
Well, I mean, let me go back to the Ajax example real quick here. It's not too, okay. So yes, I mean, yeah. So, I mean, I have my variables that represent the data from my application. The data comes from an Ajax call, in this case, one API endpoint. And yes, I changed the result that comes back. You see, it used uppercase. I didn't like it. I made it, a bit more nicer for my code formatting, and I
Mhm.
copied it over. That's pretty standard for JavaScript applications, though, right?
Yeah, and I'm thinking like, let's say, we run, let's say, the Acrobat plugin, and we're getting metadata from that piece that exists somewhere else. I always have to copy that into this, to use it locally to be able to manipulate it or bind it or things like that, right? So if it's not coming from just a simple Ajax call.
Yeah, but I mean, again, that would apply everywhere, React, Vue, Angular, etc. If you have something external to the application, like for example, the Adobe PDF embed, if you have something external, then you're going to have to set up a way for that to communicate, and you will have to duplicate a bit, I guess, the data inside, or if not duplicate, make a way. So I could add a method here, like get stuff from embed, where maybe when my application loads, it speaks to that external application using global variables, and then
Yeah.
does something to make that available to the local application. That again, like that would be true for any front end framework.
Okay. I mostly do just vanilla JavaScript, so I don't run into these things as much. That's why I'm asking. So
Yeah. I was a big Vue user. When Vue 3 kind of, in my opinion, gave up being a good choice for progressive enhancement, I really switched to like vanilla JS for almost everything. To me, Alpine fits that need of I'm doing something simple, but I would like the additional help of what Alpine provides, especially if I'm doing a lot of rendering in the HTML.
all right, thanks.
Hey
Anyone
Ray,
else?
I'm still trying to wrap my head around when and why I would use this, and maybe I'm kind of like stuck in a different spot, and I just need to take it from like a different point of view. I'm just so used to be able to like, tag anything or touch anything in the DOM and twist it, turn it out, whatever have you. Whereas this case, like you said with Vue, you had to define like I'm only gonna mess with like this stuff on the right hand side and go
Mhm.
from there. Like what would be a good example? I think you said earlier on, just something really simple, not an app, something where you just want a little help. Because
So
usually it starts little and then grows into something
yeah,
huge.
so I think the example I gave of table sorting would be a good one, and certainly if you're doing things like pagination, I want to get my data from a remote server. I want to render in a table. I want to allow the user to sort that table based on whatever they think makes sense, and I want to paginate as well. That's something where I could do that in vanilla JavaScript, but I think Alpine would help me do a lot of the DOM manipulation a little bit better. And in fact, I'm pretty sure I could well right there in front of me, building tables, sorting, and paging in AlpineJS. I'm just going to scroll down to the very last example so you can see like the final result. Um, and don't tell me Alpine is dead again. Or I shouldn't blame Alpine. I should blame Unpackage. Yeah, they're having issues. So this would have been a good example, I think, of where it would help out a lot. I think another great place would be any kind of complex search. So I have a CMS for my database, and I have a lot of data there, and my editors need a way to find records. Let's say search products, for example. So I may have a search field where I have a free form text to search for a product name, but I want to search for a product type. I want to search for availability. I want to search for products in certain categories. I've seen some admin interfaces where the search was like 8 or 9 different form fields because their data was so complex. I think Alpine would be great for that. That's not really an application per se. It's just running code on one page, but it is a bit hefty. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, that helps out a lot. And I put in the chat, I was like, well, that's a first when you got that 500 error. It's like, I never seen that where the CDN is like, okay, 500. But yeah, that definitely helps.
It's a shame that thing is undependable at the wrong exact time.
I'm
Use
just
that
happy.
to run different code examples a lot. I've never run into that, but
I'm just happy I waited till I was like down to my last sample.
right. Does anyone else got anything? Scott, I think you're the first time you've been to one of our meetings. Got any questions for Ray?